Hello, and welcome to The Bookshelf, a series brought to you by the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore, where we look at books pertinent to the study of contemporary South Asia. In this edition, we will be discussing the book, No-Win War, The Paradox of US-Pakistan Relations in Afghanistan Shadow, with its author, Zahid Hussain. Zahid Hussain is an award-winning journalist and writer who has covered Pakistan and Afghanistan for the Times of London, the Wall Street Journal, and Newsweek for almost 3 decades. He was Pakistan Scholar at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and has been a visiting fellow at Wolfson College, University of Cambridge, and at the Henry Stimson Center, Washington, D.C. He is the author of 2 earlier books, Frontline Pakistan, The Struggle with Militant Islam, and The Scorpion's Tail, The Relentless Rise of Islamic Militants in Pakistan. Today, Mr. Hussain will be in conversation with Professor C. Raja Mohan, Director at ISAS. I welcome you both to the bookshelf. Professor Mohan, please.
Thank you, John, for the introduction. And welcome, Zahid, for this bookshelf. I mean, it's wonderful seeing you as part of ISAS activity. So, Zahid, we could begin by, this book is a very timely book, The No-Win War, that it has come at a time when Afghanistan is not just in the regional headlines, but in the global headlines. And you cover a very, 2 decades of this American war in Afghanistan. Could you just tell us a bit of the background, how you got to doing this book and how it has evolved in your mind? Because your experience of covering this region is really without much parallel in the world.
Thank you, Raymond. Nice to see you. Well, actually, I've been covering Pakistan and Afghanistan for last 3 decades. And in fact, actually, for last 2 decades, I have been in and out of Afghanistan. I covered actually all the 3. In fact, actually, I started covering Afghanistan way back in 1991. That was my first assignment, foreign assignment. And that was the period when Najibullah government was in power. Soviet forces have withdrawn from there. And so I saw all the phases, subsequent phases, civil war in Afghanistan, rise of Taliban, and then actually the American war in Afghanistan. So that was the interest. And when I was in Woodrow Wilson Center for a scholar, as a Pakistan scholar, I started working on a project which was actually Pakistan tribal area and regional security. At that point of time, my thesis was that whatever happened in tribal areas of Pakistan, that will determine the course of politics and regional politics. So that was my beginning, but things moved very, very fast. So then I broadened my subject. And then working on this Pakistan-US relation, and in the shadow of Afghanistan, because the new alignment which came in 2001, soon after the terrorist attack in New York and Washington. So this alignment, Pakistan-US alignment, was very different from the past alignment. Pakistan and US have been in and out of an alliance last 70 years. And in the past, actually, there have always been some convergence, some degree of convergence between the 2 countries that brought them together. There were also a lot of divergences, a lot of differences. But 2001, it was a very unique relationship, I must say. And in a respect that there was not much of a convergence of interest. Pakistan was pursuing completely different policy in Afghanistan, and US was supporting the other side. So, but when 9/11 happened, United States needed Pakistan for its operation in Afghanistan, and Pakistan at that point also thought actually that would be expedient to support the United States in what was then called war on terror. And but basically the alliance, yes, they basically agreed on something. They fought together against Al Qaeda. But when it comes to the Taliban, the differences were from very outset. Pakistan has always actually was, skeptical of U.S. strategy in Afghanistan. So that was a it's kind of a strange relationship where the two countries cooperated in certain areas, and then actually there was a huge gap on the other way. Like for example, so this is the story of U.S.-Pakistan relation in the last 20 years, a roller coaster rather, where we see the cooperation as well as the the tension between the two.
In fact, I would tell all of viewers to actually take a look at this book. It's a wonderful read, and it covers the 20 years of historical moments in Pakistan and Afghanistan. And I must also tell our viewers is what happened there is not just about Pakistan and Afghanistan, but it has had a powerful impact on the subcontinent as a whole, because the international relations of the region changed profoundly. And then, of course, the events of 9/11 had a great impact on the world, on the US. And today, as we reflect on the US withdrawal, we think about what it has meant for endless wars in the United States and how America's own thinking on the world has changed. But I have a question for you, Zahid. I mean, that you cover your focus of the book is on the last 20 years. But in your introduction to the book, you mentioned there is a backstory. I mean, that the problem in Afghanistan did not begin on September 11th, 2001. You yourself said you started covering it in the wake of the Soviet withdrawal back in 89, 91. And before that, actually, the Russian occupation, the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan, that really, in a way, begins a very different story in Afghanistan. The Russian intervention, the American response, and the whole creation of an insurgency, jihad, whatever you want to call it, supported by Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and the United States. So just tell our viewers the backstory, that what happened before 2001. After all, bin Laden himself was part of the campaign against the Soviet occupation.
Well, actually, yes, you are absolutely right. When we talk about Afghanistan's situation, it's not just 20 years of war. It is 40 years of war, 4 decades of war. So it all started from the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. And that was brought the entire region into conflict, and some kind of, it became rather global conflict. And in a way, actually, become the conflict between the two superpowers. And Pakistan, being the frontline state, was also became part of it. They did not have any choice but to become a part of it. And at that point of time, the dynamics were completely different. That was the era of Cold War. And so obviously that became a kind of conflict between communist bloc and the so-called free world. And Pakistan had been the part of the so-called US bloc for a very long time, until 1965. Pakistan was a member of 2 military pacts with the United States, SETO and CENTO, if you remember. And then actually this Soviet invasion took place. So that was the time that the new era of Pakistan-US alliance happened. And that was basically quite a strong convergence of interest. US interest was obviously to defeat Soviet Union and to force it out of Afghanistan. And it was also seen as a revenge for Vietnam War, American stimulation in Vietnam. So Pakistan became the center of conflict, because the Mujahideen war in Afghanistan was fought from the bases in Pakistan. And we all know that thousands of Islamic warriors or jihadists from all over the Muslim world came to Pakistan, and one of them was Osama bin Laden. And at that point, I remember actually that those very jihadi leaders were called the freedom fighters. And a very interesting picture I've seen lately of Jalaluddin Haqqani leading a delegation of Afghan Mujahideen to White House, where President Reagan said that they are the biggest fighter for freedom. So that kind of situation. So obviously, at that point, Islamists were seen as the biggest bulwark against the West battle against the Soviet bloc. Yeah. And so, so that became that changed Pakistan completely. That became Pakistan became the hub of all Islamic militancy. After the Soviet withdrawal of Soviet forces in 1989, the American industry completely vanished, and particularly after disintegration of Soviet Union, that was end of the communist bloc. So United States interest in was minimal. It pulled out, and in fact, actually, that was also very interesting turn. It took place in 1990s. From 1980s, they were the best allies. They fought a very successful covert war against the superpower, and then actually in 1990s, the relationship between United States and Pakistan sunk to the lowest ebb. Yeah. Pakistan became from the best allied or the closest ally, became the most sanctioned country. Yeah. So 1990s, actually, if you see the background when 2001 happened, it was completely turned around for both of them. From the most sanctioned country, Pakistan again became an ally of the United States in another war in Afghanistan. And the expectations were very different then. Pakistan was supposed to fight the people, the forces which at one, both have supported.
I want to come to how the US-Pakistan thing evolved, but before that, what you said about that it was not just merely a strategic, people keep using the word great game, but it was really, it had an effect on Pakistan. I mean, I think the strategies Americans used, as you mentioned, Pakistan became the center of Islamic militancy. So, I mean, and also it coincided with Ziaul Haq, General Ziaul Haq, who came to power in the late 70s, really changing the domestic politics and the constitutional structure of putting religion in the center of things. So in a sense, the two trends fused. I mean, one was the external support for militancy. I remember sitting in Delhi and all the congressmen coming to Peshawar, standing next to the long-bearded gentleman and saying, look, freedom fighters, we are here to support them. And then, so that the external global strategy of the West coincided with the internal reorientation of Pakistan under Ziaul Haq.
Yeah, sure. Actually, that changed Pakistan completely, changed Pakistan domestically, changed the whole dynamics, political dynamics in the country. And it basically led to what we call actually Islamization of the country. It was, it suited the military ruler that at one point actually Islamic militancy. On the other hand, actually, he used that to strengthen its power. And interestingly, the United States, despite all those claims of supporting democracy and the free world, they always had very good relations with the military dictatorship, and that suited it. And that's what actually we saw. Pakistan became the center of militancy. Pakistan's it was also saw the rise of domestic militant organization. Yet it was used for some other wars also. I mean, like with the Kashmir, it was also kind of become the part of Kashmir conflict. And so basically we could never come out. And the problem, and what we witnessed after 2001 is that the same group, same elements, which was patronized by the state, came back to haunt us. And when we got involved in another war in Afghanistan, and somehow, so that brought actually the country or a direct conflict with the Islamic militants, who at once actually were seen as a lie. And and what we saw in 20 years, Pakistan's tribal areas particularly became the center. Almost we lost to the Taliban, what is called Pakistani Taliban. So that actually has caused Pakistan tremendously. So in a way, if we last 40 years, if we see the history, on the one side, we we supported the militancy, we propped up the Islamic militant group, and then actually after 20 years, we were supposed to fight exactly the same elements. For America, it was very different. America was about 10,000 miles away from this. So whatever they supported in 1980 did not, I mean, they did have to come back to hound them also, but they were not as directly affected as Pakistan was. So in a way, actually, the whole 40 years history of Pakistan being a frontline state in a perpetual conflict.
See, in a sense, actually, these decades, the 4 decades of this, continuous conflict in Afghanistan, because as you said, look, changed Pakistan. It's also changed the subcontinent as a whole. I mean, I could see when I first came to Delhi in the early 70s. I mean, you rarely see a security person. You rarely saw a metal detector anywhere. Rarely you could walk into the Prime Minister's house as students. We could go. All that changed. I mean, dramatically, the securitization of subcontinent's politics. I mean, I think that's been one of the lasting outcomes, and which is kind of continues to be with us. But I wanted to ask you, your title of the book, The No-Win War. But today, as you read, the commentary in Pakistan or other places, it's quite clear. At least one side thinks they won. I mean, the fact that, that the Taliban government takes charge 2 years exactly after 9/11. It couldn't have been more dramatic, more, so stark that actually has one side won, has Taliban and Pakistan won this 4 decades of war in Afghanistan?
Well, actually, to some extent, you can say that. But yes, what I meant actually, the American war in Afghanistan, that was basically an America. For America, it was a no-win. Yeah. I mean, from the very beginning, it was very clear that they did not have any idea what they were going into. And some of the things have come very clearly, actually, if you've seen this new book, and earlier that those articles were published in Washington Post about Afghanistan paper. So that was, I mean, I think Taliban won. So it was a no-win war for Americans, and suddenly it's very ironic and a part of history, like that. The same forces which America went to oust them when they after 18 years they were negotiating with the same people, and it was quite an interesting paradox that way, and. So it was a surrender by the United States. They may not, but Doha Agreement, I always described it as a surrender document, because that was the beginning of the end of Afghan government. And so we cannot actually say that the Afghan army actually just collapsed. It ought to have happened. That was decided at Doha in 2020.
One question, I mean, that comes to my mind, I mean, which is really when we look back, if you see the early documents of the US, they were not really interested in Afghanistan. I used to meet American scholars and senior military figures who came to Delhi after 2001. I mean, Taliban was not even mentioned as a problem. If you see the early years, It was always Al-Qaeda and its associates. Never, Taliban did not even seen as a threat well into, over the last decade. But till then, the American focus was so much on international terrorism, and that they didn't really see what the consequences of their actions for Taliban's rise.
Well, yes, absolutely right. Actually, 2003, President Bush announced a victory over Taliban and end of war. And you're absolutely right. In the beginning, actually, American Taliban were history. And they were defeated, and so they were only focused on fighting Al-Qaeda, and there was no pressure on Pakistan. America never asked Pakistan to stop Taliban coming into Pakistan and taking sanctuary here. No, until 2004, there was no mention of Taliban. There was certainly actually, and that was the period. First 2 years, the relationship went very well because they were both cooperating, fighting Al-Qaeda. So that way, yes, actually, as very interesting. Bob Grenier, who was CIA station chief in Pakistan, he wrote a very good book, actually. It's 80 Days from Kandahar. And that's what he described. America had not fought one war in Afghanistan. In fact, the country had fought two wars in Afghanistan. First was from October 2001 and to 2003, when they in fact actually achieved whatever objective they had. They ousted the Taliban regime. They pushed Al Qaeda, and most of them then fled to Pakistan. But then second Afghan war started in 2005, 2006 with the rise of insurgency. And then actually we saw what the surge in troops and the number of American troops in Afghanistan went up to almost, plus NATO forces, almost went up to 200,000. So in a way, actually, they did not have any realization that that they will be bogged down in a protracted war, which will become the longest war ever actually America fought in that. So they did not have any idea about it. And it's quite, even the top officials, like for example, General Zut, who was called the Tsar of Afghan and Iraq war, he was number 2 in National Security Committee, both under Bush and then Obama. And he was quoted as saying, we didn't have the foggiest idea of what we were going to do there. Yeah. So that explains everything about this war, American war in Afghanistan.
One of the things your book really tracks it beautifully is really the complex dynamic that emerged between US and Pakistan. One level, US depended on Pakistan for the ground level access to geography demanded, because they could have accessed it through Iran, but they had no relationship with Iran. With Pakistan was the main staging post for actually doing things there. They had to bring in all their supplies through Pakistan. So they had to depend on the intelligence support of Pakistan. So in a way that the war could not have been fought with Pakistan. But at the same time, the objectives of the two sides were different, as you say in the book, that they were really looking at the situation in two fundamentally different ways. Can you just simply explain that? I mean, I think that the difficulty for the two sides in managing this complex evolution in the last 20 years.
Yeah, it was a kind of relationship, very odd relationship, which have often been described as a frenemy. Means that one hand they were friends, they were allied, but on the other hand they have been fighting, or in fact actually it's a full tension-ridden relationship. But interestingly, I mean, even the time actually when it was like roller coaster. On one day they seemed to be cooperating, they were talking to each other, and certain fields they seemed actually going very well. And in the second day we see actually they were quarreling. So it was kind of bad marriage, but could not have been broken. They could not afford to separate because there was still something between, and some interest actually between the two. And I think probably the turning point in Pakistan came actually, as I said earlier, 2006. But that turned into from what so-called strategic relation to transactional relationship. In 2011 was I think probably a kind of change the thing, not a radical change in relationship. It was actually the whole year, like started from January, when there's CIA undercover. Yeah. Davis was arrested for shooting 2 guys here. Then came in May, raid on Osama bin Laden compound, and the worst came in October 2011, when when the US force jets actually bombed at a Pakistani border post and killed about 20 Pakistani soldiers. And that was the time actually when Pakistan closed the G-lock, airlock actually for almost 8 months. And that was if you see the toughest period in the relationship between the two. They restored it later on because America still wanted an exit from Afghanistan. And without Pakistan's support, it could not have happened. But on that 2011 onward, the relationship had something like very clear, defined, differences. Like, for example, that was the period when America, there was surge took place and the famous theory of Patriot counterinsurgency plan strategy. So Pakistan has a differences from the very beginning. Pakistan has told America many times that there's no military solution to Afghanistan and we should talk to Taliban. So in a way, actually, that was the reason when they stuck together despite all those problems in the relationship, because America wanted to exit and Pakistan's interest was also that some kind of stability come back to Afghanistan. So that kept them together.
Now with the, in a sense, Americans leaving Afghanistan, how do you see this relationship between US and Pakistan unfold in the coming days? We saw Secretary Blinken was really hammered on a whole range of issues, including on Pakistan. So, where do you see the US-Pakistan relationship of 4 decades of collaboration, contestation? Today, you see the Americans less interested in Pakistan, or they'll be more interested because terrorism problem is not simply disappeared, and they still need Pakistan. Americans need Pakistan to access Afghanistan, to deliver humanitarian assistance, to engage with the Taliban. So in a sense, the Pakistan geography has given Pakistan this critical role, and I don't see that role disappearing just because Americans have left.
Well, actually, over the last 10 years, particularly, US-Pakistan relation, from 2011 onward, US have seen Pakistan purely through Afghan prism. And that was their interest throughout. I mean, like, it was not as some kind of strategic alignment. Yeah. It was a very limited one, and it was the interest in Afghanistan that kept them together. And after after Taliban takeover, things that it has taken another dimension. Now it is basically another turning point. Now, actually, it's not even it will continue to be some sort of transactional relationship because there's again actually Afghanistan. For last 3-4 years, Americans were quite dependent on Pakistan for negotiation, peace negotiation. But still, actually, the interest may have diminished because they have pulled out. But pulling out troops from Afghanistan does not mean that American interests have completely gone. And so, in a way, actually, somehow they will have this relationship, but again, purely from Afghan prism. And Pakistan will be expected, as Blinken said yesterday, to do Americans' bidding in Afghanistan. And so, then again, there will be some problem because the basic reason for this tension in Pakistan-US relation that America always wanted Pakistan to do what it was considered in its interest. So there was nothing actually that what was Pakistan's national interest. So that was the major point of conflict. So now again, actually, it will not be any illusion of a strategic alliance. It will be purely transactional relationship, but also that the whole regional geopolitics has changed now. Yeah. It's not only Afghanistan, but also US, China.
Yeah, in fact, I wanted to ask you on that. I mean, one of the big changes compared to the 1979, compared to the 90s, the rise of China, and today Chinese capacity, both in terms of their economic resources, to be able to define the future of this region. Because if you go to the 90s, when Pakistan won managed to push the Russians out, they had a victory, but they couldn't do much with it because there was not an economic dimension to it. But today, China brings in a whole lot of resources. You mentioned the CPEC. So how do you see Chinese role emerging in Pakistan and Afghanistan after the American retreat?
Well, actually, yes, actually, there has been, a dimensional change in the regional geopolitics over the last 2 decades, but with the rise of China. In fact, if China-Pakistan relationship, it was strategic from the very outset. It started way back in 1960s, and obviously the reason was, obviously the regional politics of power balance, and it continued for about three decades. And it was like actually there were mutual interest, security interest. China saw Pakistan as a part of its national security strategy, and Pakistan obviously with its diminishing relationship with the United States also banked mostly on China, and also because the China-India conflict and all those factors also were to bringing them together. But in last 20 years, we saw some kind of a new dimension in the relationship between China and Pakistan, and that was economic dimension. It did not exist before, and so basically, it's not just a military cooperation between the two countries, but it's also the economic cooperation, which has changed the whole dynamics of relationship. In fact, actually, China is now the biggest investor in Pakistan. CPAC, almost 25 to 30 billion dollars have already been spent, and it's supposed to go up to about 80 billion dollars investment. So that has brought actually China and India very closely into an economic relationship, and it will further going to strengthen because of the Gwadar Port. That's going to become quite critical in China's future economic planning, and so that will the closeness of China. But I don't see it all happen just because Pakistan's relations with the United States have gone sour. It also has its own dynamics, regional dynamics, I would say, and so now actually with the rising tension between United States and China, it will become much more difficult for Pakistan to maintain a balance. When keeping this line, obviously for Pakistan, China's relationship is the most critical. It's a strategic relationship. But it does not mean that they would like actually to completely sever ties with the United States. They would like, because still, despite all those growing economic relationship between China and Pakistan, United States remained the biggest export market for Pakistan. And then actually there were several other factors. So I think it will be hard for Pakistan how to balance it if the conflict between United States and China worse. So that will become much more difficult. So in a way, actually, Pakistan's geographical situation or geostrategic situation makes it a perpetual, center of conflict. In fact.
We're beginning to run out of time, so I just want to ask you the last question. I think we briefly mentioned it, the impact that that the Soviet occupation and the American support for jihad had on Pakistan and Zia's own policies. But when Musharraf came, where your story begins in your book, General Musharraf talked about enlightened moderation, trying to liberalize the Pakistani society, and of actually confronting some of these groups. Remember, the groups tried to assassinate him as well. So why did that phase where Musharraf was so powerful, he launches this whole thing of towards moderation, towards confronting the extremism? What changed in Pakistani calculus that towards the end that didn't seem to? And then you had the Nawaz Sharif era, where you had remember the Dawn Leaks story. It was a question of the civilian leaders saying that, look, these groups are bad for Pakistan. And then you have actually Imran Khan saying, no, that these groups are actually, it was the problem was the American war. This was, so in a sense, the up and down of the domestic politics in relation to militancy, what it means for Pakistan, it has seen so many different phases. Now, where do you see that going? The relationship of the Pakistani state and these groups?
Well, actually, 2001 was also a turning point for Pakistan as far as domestic politics was concerned. It was not just the geopolitics. Pakistan, when it became the this ally of United States in this new war and have to confront the same forces which it had supported. So it will change the dynamic. So what Musharraf tried to do is to break away from the Zia legacy, because it became untenable. Because on the one side, actually, they have turned into this alignment, which was supposed to be actually fighting the militant. So in a way, actually, that also put Musharraf government into conflict with the militancy. So Pakistan became the center of a militant war. In fact, actually, it was as serious as it was being fought in Afghanistan. Like 2007, 2008, this tribal region, which supposed was earlier called FATA, Federal and State Territories, they almost had gone to Taliban, Pakistani Taliban, and there was hardly any difference between Pakistani Taliban and Taliban. So in a way, actually, that Musharraf did try actually to break away from the old legacy, and then actually, and it's a part of that, if you remember, Rajmohan, that was also part when Musharraf tried to improve relations with India, and that was 2004 when this back channel started, and I think probably settlement 2007. It went very well actually. It was relationship between the two countries completely changed during that period. I cannot imagine any other.
I remember traveling so much in that period. There was so much contact between journalists, civil societies.
And so there was hope. So the whole thing, Musharraf understood that if they had to fight the militancy in Pakistan, then you had to improve relations with India. They cannot go together. So that was one of the reasons. Then actually, obviously, Musharraf's downfall came because of certain mistakes he made domestically. And so obviously there's always, military rulers can rule to some length, but time comes where, that people start actually feeling disenchanted with that. Musharraf's hold was very strong until 2007. There's no doubt about it. Nobody thought actually that it would go away. But obviously, there are two or three decisions he made during that period brought his power. And it was actually, I don't think it was unavoidable. It could not have been avoided, because there were also the political factors were there. Bhutto and Nawaz Sharif came back. So for the military, I think it became very difficult to keep supporting an unpopular leader at that point. So that was the downfall. But when I was discussing in my book about Pakistan and American relationship and what was happening, so there was, and it has also actually has a huge impact on Pakistan's civil and military relationship. And that basically was quite critical, because throughout this period, but earlier when Musharraf was in power, there was a chain of command, that he was all powerful. So there was no friction, no contradiction. But 2008, when Pakistan returned to democracy and civilian, so obviously that military civil relationship also surfaced. And it had actually some of the things had to do with Pakistan's relation with the United States also. I mean, like they got mixed up also.
We've really run out of time. Zahid Hussain, thank you very much for a wonderful book, which covers an important slice of history, not just of Pakistan and Afghanistan, but of the subcontinent as a whole. And it's really worth reading for anybody interested in South Asia. It gives a window of insights into a very, very important moment in the evolution of South Asia. Thank you, Zahid Hussain. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Raja Mohan, and for a lovely discussion.